Well, okay. Welcome to Bigfoot's Wilderness. My name is Mike, and let's go ahead and get into this encounter story. It's called Old Man Bigfoot. I think we all reflect on our childhoods from time to time. We take the good with the bad, and some things we forget or they get buried deep in our subconscious. Well, it's not exactly true. Something, a long time ago, shook me to my core and still gives me sleepless nights on occasion to this day. Everything kind of bubbled up all at once at a family reunion. Somehow, we got on the subject of the farm and Old Man Bigfoot. That's what they called it. I felt like I got hit over the head with a hammer. My shock and embarrassment came right back. I felt like that 14-year-old all over again, even though I was more than twice that age now. I wanted to crawl in a hole, as some of them quipped and joked at the thought of the existence of a Bigfoot and the fact that I'd actually seen one. I was under the impression that my dad had brushed off my encounter, but apparently not. He remembered every detail I shared with him all those years ago. It was every bit of 20 years ago when my life would change and my story began, with my parents deciding it was time to move away from the big city. We were from Boston, Massachusetts. My dad announced at the dinner table that he and my mom had just purchased a farm in South Georgia. Georgia? We're from Boston. My father said it was a deal that he couldn't refuse. He'd grown up on a ranch in Montana and was itching to get back to the farm life. Well, he'd been scouting around for a while and wanted a warmer climate too. And my mom, well, she was very supportive of the change. After all, they'd met when my mom was a traveling nurse at a college. The cost of living, and not to mention the crime, was affecting our standard of living in Boston. My twin sisters heckled me since they were heading off to college and weren't really affected by the move. They only came for short visits, as they interned during the summer. We left family and friends and made the move over the summer as I turned 14. Maybe my parents did a great job brainwashing me because I was so excited about the change and the fact that my dad would be getting horses among other livestock. My parents had also decided to homeschool me. My twin sisters and I both did well in school, but I was just the opposite when it came to being social. I just buried myself in books about animals. I was well read, but not the least bit experienced. I didn't know much of anything when it came to the animals themselves. But that was all about to change, and I think I adjusted very well. In the beginning, I couldn't tell one end of a wrench from the other, but I really wanted to learn. And that thirst for knowledge came from my dad. He knew that I was a lot like him. I think in some ways he pitied my lack of knowledge because of the environment I grew up in. I was a city boy. So he groomed me, and I watched, listened, and learned by performing tasks until I got more familiar with how a farm worked. I'm not ashamed to admit that I didn't understand what my priorities needed to be. My true indoctrination began on one cool, crisp morning before the sun came up. My dad woke me to let me know that horses would be coming soon and the feed he'd purchased would need to be moved to the old shed. I practically jumped out of bed. I was so excited at the thought of having horses. I wanted to be a cowboy, just like my dad. It was only a few bags, but I still remember how heavy they were and difficult to carry. As I dropped the first bag at the corner of the horse shed, my hamstrings were burning, so I sat down on the bag for a moment before walking back. Off in the distance, along the wood line, I could hear coughing. I stood up and stared intently. This must be a trespasser because we owned the land around me as far as the eye could see. The coughing continued, not a soul in sight. Who was this? My dad and the crew were at an auction, so they wouldn't be back for hours. The surprising part was how loud the coughing was. It almost echoed. My years of living in the city gave me heightened paranoia, and it was kicking in. I went off to mention it to my mother. She was on the phone talking to relatives and kind of just shushed me. I watched from the window for a while and then decided to finish off my chores. As I dragged another bag off to the shed, I immediately noticed the first one was missing. In the next few seconds, I could hear the crumpling of paper and chewing and a garbled deep growl. Behind the shed, in what would be the far corner, were the sounds of something ravenously eating what had to be horse feed. I walked cautiously out and away, but towards it. I was hoping I would catch a glimpse of what it had to be a bear. But could a bear pick up a 50-pound bag of feed and carry it 30 feet? My next thought was that the coughing I heard earlier, was this some sort of a bum or homeless man? As I walked in a semicircular fashion towards the back, my jaw practically dropped. It was a man, but not a man. His body was covered with gray hair, and his face, well, it looked 100 years old. He stared up from the bag for a moment and snarled at me. What teeth he had were yellow and brown. Disgusting. I was so stunned I just backed off slowly. I guess he understood my intentions, and as I backed up, he stood up. I kept backing up, but just couldn't take my eyes off of him. He had to be every bit of 7 feet in height, and even though his face looked so old, his build appeared powerful. His long gray muscular arms hung off the very broad shoulders. His head just seemed to sit between those big wide shoulders. And I kept up my retreat until I thought I was at a safe distance away, never taking my eyes off it. Being a kid myself, I really didn't have any idea how to handle this potential threat. I was too afraid to run and too afraid to stay, so I cried a little. And I may have soiled my pants too. He took another look at me, but this time the snarl was gone. No noise, no sound. He held the leftover bag of feed in his right hand, and then reached down and grabbed the other bag of feed with his left. His hands were enormous, and he held each bag like they were nothing. He gave me one more blank stare, and then bounded off toward the woodline. I watched him run and almost glide away. Even at a long distance, he still seemed gigantic. Later that afternoon, when my dad and the crew arrived back, I tried to pull him aside and explain what happened. I was too embarrassed to mention it in front of everyone. I'm closer to my dad than my mom, and I kind of expected that he would have believed me. Instead, I got, a what? And you're telling me 2 bags of feed are missing? How? Tell you what, let me ask Trevor if there's any bear down here, but you said it was gray? I don't know what to think. Maybe I saw a bear. I began to doubt myself. I was dying of embarrassment. Yeah, it was a gray-colored bear. Several weeks later, our horses finally arrived. It was an exciting time for me. My dad was teaching me how to ride, and I spent most of my available time around my new favorite hobby. One night, as I finished up my homework, my dad came in with a funny look on his face. My mom asked what was wrong. Oh, nothing. I just heard coughing, like a loud hacking kind of cough, out in the woods on the other side of the field. I'm pretty sure the blood drained from my face as my eyes grew wide with fear. I thought to myself, the old man, he's back. That night, 2 of our chickens went missing from the hen house, and so did a bag of feed from the back of my dad's pickup. My dad said that nothing was broken or disturbed in the hen house, so it must be a trespasser. I asked him why. And he said, well, it had to have hands. And it did have hands. They were enormous hands. I suppose the old man found easy pickings passing by our farm. I found the nerve to bring it up again to my dad. He seemed a little more accepting, but not because of the story necessarily. I just confirmed what he'd heard from others. It turns out that something was stealing livestock and feed from neighboring farms too in the area, and it was spotted. Apparently, it was a very big, broad animal with gray hair. Who's going to believe a kid, right? I'd come a long way with my tools. I enjoyed woodworking and my father tasked me with building a feed bin for the horses. I even took it to the extra step by adding a padlock. In the back of my mind, I was never going to forget the old man and his fondness for feed. All of it came rushing back at the family reunion, along with the embarrassment. Sometimes sleep doesn't come easy. His face is ingrained in my memory, and I know why. Because these creatures are real, but nobody wants to believe in them.